Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Funky Bunch at Sunday Brunch Podcast. How are you all doing today? Are we all having a fine Sunday as we are in the last Sunday of the month of April? It's time for us to just dive right on in and continue with a look at the role playing genre. So, today's goal is we're going to try to hit the last three topics of the role playing genre. So, first off, let's go over the overview of what a role playing video game is. So, role playing video games draw their gameplay from traditional tabletop role playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. Most of these cast the player in the role of a character that grows in strength and experience over the course of the game. By overcoming difficult challenges and or defeating monsters, the player gain experience points which represent the character's progress in a chosen profession or class, such as melee combat or ranged magic spells, and allow the player to gain new abilities once a set amount are obtained. Many RPGs contain an open world known as an overworld, which is usually populated with monsters that allows access to more important game locations, such as towns, dungeons, and castles. Since the emergence of affordable home computers coincided with the popularity of paper and pencil role-playing games, this genre was one of the first in video games and continues to be popular today. Gameplay elements strongly associated with RPG, such as statistical character development through the acquisition of experience points, have been widely adapted to other genres such as action-adventure games. Though nearly all of the early entries in the genre were turn-based games, many modern role-playing games progress in real time. Thus, the genre has followed the strategy games trend of moving from turn-based to real-time combat. The move to real-time combat began with the release of Square's Final Fantasy IV, the first game to use the active time battle system. This was quickly followed by a truly real-time action role-playing games such as the Mana series, the Soul Blazer, and Ultima 7. Although older turn-based systems still exist, such as the Golden Sun series for the Game Boy Advance, as well as Pokemon. So yeah, that's the overview, but then we're going to just take exactly what they just told us and kind of flip it, turn upside down, as we look at the roguelike subgenre. So, roguelike is a subgenre of role-playing video games characterized by a dungeon crawl through procedurally generated levels, turn-based gameplay, grid-based movement, and permanent death of the player character. Most roguelikes are based on a high fantasy narrative, reflecting their influence from tabletop role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons. Though Beneath Apple Manor predates it, the 1980 game Rogue, which was an ASCII-based game that runs in Terminal or Terminal Emulator, is considered the forerunner and the namesake of the genre, with derivative games mirroring Rogue's character or sprite-based graphics. These games were popularized among college students and computer programmers of the 1980s and 1990s, leading to hundreds of variants. Some of the better known variants include Hack, NetHack, Ancient Domains of Mystery, Moria, Angband, Tales of Mauj Isle, and Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup. The Japanese series of mystery dungeon games by Chunsoft, inspired by Rogue, also fall within the concept of roguelike games. The exact definition of a roguelike game remains a point of debate in the video game community. A Berlin interpretation drafted in 2008 defined a number of high and low value factors that distinguish the pure roguelike games, Rogue, NetHack, and Angband, from edge cases like Diablo. Since then, with more powerful home computers and gaming systems and the rapid growth of indie video game development, several new roguelikes have appeared with some but not all of those high-value factors. Nominally, the use of procedural generation and permadeath, while often incorporating other gameplay genres, thematic elements, and graphical styles. Common examples of these include Splunky, FTL Faster Than Light, The Binding of Isaac, Slay the Spire, and Hades. To distinguish these from traditional roguelikes, such games may be referred to as roguelite or roguelike or procedural death labyrinths. So a roguelike, the things to remember about a roguelike is you can never play the same game twice, and it's permadeath. That's the main things that truly make up a roguelike, or maybe I'm just familiar with roguelike. For instance, when I was playing The Binding of Isaac, I have one try to go through. Sure, there's an item I can pick up that can grant me an extra life, but you die, game over, start over. And the next time you start the game, you'll have a completely different setup. Right. Don't Starve is a roguelike as well. Simply because every time you open the map, it's a completely different map. Unless you're playing multiplayer or something where, Well, the fact that you can save on the map is very different in terms of a roguelike. The only way you save is on the front screen when you've died. You can exit out of The Binding of Isaac and still be able to start at your spot, but you can't save, try to do something, die, and then reload your save type of deal. But yeah, no, I mean, I guess that's true. It just deletes it all, so okay. Yeah, that's fair. I'll be honest, I haven't played Don't Starve. I've only played Don't Starve Together, and that was only heavily modded because I just didn't enjoy the game. Alright, so the origin of the term roguelike came from Usenet newsgroups from 1993, as this was the principal channel the players of roguelike games of that period were using to discuss these games, as well as what the developers used to announce new releases and even distribute the game's source code in some cases. With several individual groups for each game, it was suggested that with the rising popularity of Rogue, Hack, Moria, and Angband, all with which shared common elements, that the groups be consolidated under an umbrella term based on Rogue, being the oldest of these types of games, was picked as the least of all available evils. By the time it was suggested that a group be created to discuss the development... Oh, whoops. I completely skipped a line there. Let's start that over. With several individual groups for each game, it suggested that with rising popularity of Rogue, Hack, Mora, and Angband, all which shared common elements, that the groups be consolidated under an umbrella term to facilitate cross-game discussion. Debate among users of these groups ensued to try to find an encapsulating term that described the common elements, starting with rec.games.dungeon.*. But after 3 weeks of discussion, rec.games.roguelike.*, based on Rogue being the oldest of these types of games, was picked as the least of all available evils. Right. I also didn't understand at the very beginning why it was referred to as a roguelike, but I just kind of went with it. So it is nice to understand the origin of the term. So, by the time it was suggested that a group be created to discuss the development of these types of games in 1998, the roguelike term was already established within the community. The usage parallels that of Doom Clone, a term used in the 1990s that later evolved into a more generic first-person shooter. Could you imagine if, people didn't play FPSs, they just played Doom Clones? Doom Clones. Okay, gameplay and design. Drawing from the concepts of traditional tabletop role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons, nearly all roguelikes give the player control of a character, which they may customize by selecting a class, race, and gender, and adjusting attribute points and skills. At the start of the game, the character is placed at the topmost level of a dungeon with basic equipment such as a simple weapon, armor, torches, and food. Following along the role-playing concept of a dungeon crawl, the player moves the character through the dungeon, collecting treasure which may include new weapons, armors, magical devices, potions, scrolls, food, and money, while having to fight monsters that roam the dungeon. Most combat is performed simply by attempting to move the character in the same space as the monster. The game then calculates the damage that the character and the monster deal. Other types of attacks, such as firing an arrow or performing an offensive magic spell, can also be performed as well. Defeating monsters earns the character experience points, and after earning enough points, the character will gain an experience level, improving their hit points, magic capability, and other attributes. Monsters may drop treasure that can be looted. The character dies if they lose all their hit points. As most roguelikes feature the concept of permadeath, this represents the end of the game, and the player will need to restart the game with a newly made character. Roguelikes are nearly always turn-based, with the game only reacting when the player makes an action with the character. This allows players to evaluate a difficult situation, such as being cornered by several monsters, at their own pace and determine the best strategy. The player generally has to explore the dungeon to reveal its contents, similar to a fog of war. If you're not familiar with what a fog of war is, I learned about fog of war in Fire Emblem. So fog of war is really what the game developers do to hide the map. Okay, so yeah. But either way, so basically a fog of war is the map is hidden and only a certain, like, you'll unveil what the map looks like as you explore it. In some cases. In other cases, you can see the entire map, but it's got a fog of war. But the biggest thing about the fog of war is you can only see in your mini-map enemies within a certain radius of you. Outside of that radius, everything is hidden from you. So you cannot see, friendly units. You cannot see enemy units. You just can see the terrain surrounding you. So that's basically what a fog of war is in a very, very, very rough turn. I could have also just hovered over this and gotten the brief description of it, but whatever. Many roguelikes include visibility elements, such as using a torch to provide illumination to see monsters in nearby squares, or line of sight to limit which monsters are visible from the player's position. Dungeons tend to be connected by stairs. Lower dungeon levels generally are more difficult than higher dungeon ones, so that an underdeveloped character will have difficulty progressing too fast. Dungeon levels and the population of monsters and treasures within them are generated randomly using procedural generation, so no game is the same on subsequent playthroughs. Most roguelikes have an ultimate goal of either claiming an item located at the deepest level of the dungeon, or defeating a specific monster that lives on that level. Typical roguelikes assess the player's performance at the end of the game through a score based on the amount of treasures, monies, and experience earned, and how fast the player finished the game if they managed to do so. Scores is displayed in a ranked scoreboard to compare other players' performance on successive runs. So, key features of a roguelike. So what gameplay elements explicitly define a roguelike game remains a point of debate within the video game community, as does most definitions in the video game community. There's broad agreement that roguelike games incorporate gameplay elements popularized by the text-based game Rogue, which bore out many variations due to its success. As of 2015, several hundred games claiming to be roguelikes were available through the Steam game catalog, and the user-run wiki Rogue Basin tracks hundreds of roguelikes and their development. Some players and developers sought a more narrow definition for roguelikes as variation on Rogue. Introduced new concepts or eschewed other principles that they felt moved the game away from the flavor of what Rogue was. At the International Roguelike Development Conference 2008, held in Berlin, Germany, Players and developers established a definition for roguelikes known as the Berlin Interpretation. The Berlin Interpretation set out a set of high-value and low-value factors, basing these lists on 5 canon roguelike games: Adam, Angband, Lindley's Dungeon Crawl, NetHack, and Rogue. The interpretation was designed to determine how roguelike a game is, noting that missing a factor does not eliminate a game from being a roguelike, nor does possessing the features make a game roguelike. John Harris of Game Set Watch exemplifies this by using the criteria to numerically score some seemingly roguelike games. Lindley's Dungeon Crawl and NetHack scored the highest, earning 57.5 points out of available 60 points based on the interpretation, with Toe Jam and Earl and Diablo games, commonly compared to roguelikes, earned only about half of the points. The Berlin Interpretation defined 8 high-value factors. The game uses random dungeon generation to increase replayability. Games may include predetermined levels, such as a town level common to the Moira family, where the player can buy and sell equipment, but these are considered to reduce the randomness set by the Berlin Interpretation. This random generation is nearly always based on some procedural generation approach rather than true randomness. Procedural generation uses a set of rules defined by the game to developers to seed the generation of the dungeon, generally to assure that each level can be completed by the player without using special equipment, and can also generate more aesthetically pleasing levels. 2. The game uses permadeath. Once a character dies, the player must begin a new game, known as a run, which will regenerate the game's levels anew due to procedural generation. A save game feature will only provide suspension of gameplay and not a limitless recoverable state. The stored session is deleted upon resumption or character death. Players can circumvent this by backing up stored game data, known as save scumming, an act that is usually considered cheating. The developers of Rogue introduced the permadeath feature after introducing a save function, finding that players were repeatedly loading saved games to achieve the best result. According to Rogue's Michael Toy, they saw their approach to permadeath not as a means to make the game painful or difficult, but to put weight on every decision the player made, as to create a more immersive experience. The game is turn-based, giving the players as much time as needed to make a decision. Gameplay is usually step-based, where player actions are performed serially and take a variable measure of in-game time to complete. Game processes, e.g. monster movement and interaction, progressive effects such as poison or starving, advance based on the passage of time dictated by these actions. The game is non-modal, in that every action should be available to the player regardless of where they are in the game. The interpretation notes that shops like in Angband do break this non-modality. The game has a degree of complexity due to the number of different game systems in place that allow the player to complete certain goals in multiple ways, creating emergent gameplay. For example, to get through a locked door, the player may attempt to pick the lock, kick it down, burn down the door, or even tunnel around it, depending on their current situation and inventory. A common phrase associated with NetHack is, the dev team thinks of everything, and that the developers seem to have anticipated every combination of actions that the player may attempt to try in their gameplay strategy, such as using gloves to protect one's character while wielding the corpse of a cockatrice as a weapon to petrify enemies by its touch. Damn. That's hilarious. Why, yes, this is my cockatrice, and yes, I am beating people over the head with it to turn them into stone. The player must use resource management to survive. Items that help sustain the player, such as food and healing items, are in limited supply, and the player must figure out how to use these most advantageously in order to survive the dungeon. US Gamer further considers stamina decay as another feature related to resource management. The player character constantly needs to find food to survive or will die from hunger, which prevents the player from exploiting health regeneration or simply either passing turns for long periods of time or fighting very weak monsters at low-level dungeons. Rich Carlson, one of the creators of an early roguelike like Strange Adventures and Infinite Space, called this aspect a sort of clock, imposing some sort of deadline or limitation on how much the player can explore and creating tension in the game. The game is focused on hack and slash gameplay, where the goal is to kill many monsters and where other peaceful options do not exist. The game requires the player to explore the map and discover the purpose of unidentified objects in a manner that resets every playthrough. The identity of magical items, including magically enchanted items, varies from run to run. Newly discovered objects only offer a vague description that is randomized between games, with purposes and capabilities left unstated. For example, a bubbly potion might heal wounds one game, then poison the player character the next. Items are often subject to alteration, acquiring specific traits such as a curse or direct player modification. So let's look at these 8 high-value factors and compare them to a common roguelike that I played on stream before. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. So let's start with the first thing. Random dungeon generation. So every time you enter a dungeon, is it random and procedurally generated? Yes. So, but also, to reduce that randomness, if you remember, it says games may include predetermined levels such as a town level. Now, I don't know if you would consider a town level a starting point where the player exists and everything. See, I personally would argue that, well, let's keep going through. So I think it loses a little bit of the randomness due to the fact that you've got a town at the very beginning. Because otherwise, the only way you could buy or sell items is to wait for a random Kecleon shop to appear on the floor. Second one, the game uses permadeath. Once the player character dies, the player must begin a new game or a new run. So if you die in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, you lose most of your items, half of your money, and you have to restart the dungeon. However, you can save your game at save spots, either because there are some dungeons that are very, very long, and so they give you a save spot halfway through it. So that way you're not going, 40 floors straight down just to die on floor 39 and have to redo it. So I think that reduces it quite a bit. The game is turn-based. It absolutely is turn-based. Game is non-modal. What is non-modal exactly? Every action should be available to the player regardless of where they are in the game. I would say that Mystery Dungeon is not non-modal, in that if you're in the town, you cannot use your Pokemon move attacks. You can just run around. So modality, there is modality. Let's see. High degree of complexity due to the number of different game systems in place allow you to do lots of different things to get around. Yeah. So, for instance, if you have a water Pokemon, you can run through the water. If you have a flying Pokemon, you can fly over obstacles. If you're a ground-type Pokemon and you're fighting an electric-type Pokemon, no one's going to get hurt. So I would argue that it does have a high degree of complexity. Resource management to survive. There is a hunger meter. So running around does deplete your hunger, and then you start taking damage every step. if your hunger hits 0. So you have to eat food items. Let's see. Focus on hack and slash. The goal is to kill many monsters. No peaceful options. Very true. And you have to explore the map. You do. The items on the floor are random. However, they are static type items, so they're not going to change. So I would argue that... Mystery Dungeon might be a roguelike arguing based upon like the high value factors. Okay, well, let's jump down to the low value factors from the Berlin interpretation. The game is based on controlling only one single character throughout one playthrough. Monsters have behavior that is similar to the player character, such as the ability to pick up items and use them or cast spells. The game aimed to provide a tactical challenge that may require players to play through several times to learn the appropriate tactics for survival. The game is presented using ASCII characters on a tile-based map. The game involves exploring dungeons, which are made up of rooms and interconnecting corridors. Some games may have open areas or natural features such as rivers. These are these are considered against the Berlin interpretation. The game presents the status of the player and the game through numbers on the game screen interface. Mystery Dungeon, while you are controlling one single character, you also can control the other characters if you have buddy Pokemon. Monster behavior is similar. You do have a tactical challenge, which you may have to play several times to learn. It is not ASCII characters on a tile-based map, but it is a tile-based map. You're exploring dungeons made up of rooms and interconnecting corridors. However, there are some open areas within that dungeon with rivers and stuff. And the game presents the status of the player in the game. So, Though not addressed by the Berlin interpretation, roguelikes are generally single-player games. On multi-user systems, leaderboards are often shared between players. Some roguelikes allow traces of former player characters to appear in late-game sessions in the forms of ghosts or grave markers. Some games, such as NetHack, even have the player's former characters reappear as enemies within the dungeon. Multiplayer turn-based derivatives such as TomeNet, Mongbond, and Crossfire do exist and are playable online. Okay, early roguelikes. Early roguelikes were developed to be played on text-based user interfaces, commonly Unix-based computer mainframes and terminals, used at colleges and universities. Oh, God. Before transitioning to personal computers. Games used a mix of ASCII or ANSI characters to visually represent elements of dungeon levels, creatures, and items on the level as in ASCII art. These games typically include one or two text lines presenting the player's current status at the bottom of the screen and text-based menu screens to manage inventory, statistics, and other details. The player's character was nearly always represented with the ampersand, it's the @ symbol, character across text-based roguelikes, which had been chosen by the developers of Rogue to stand for where you're at. Or other common examples would include $ for monetary treasure and D for a dragon. Later games would take advantage of color-based text graphics to increase the variation of creature types, such as a red D for a red dragon that would shoot fire, while a green D would indicate a green dragon that would shoot acid. Players would use the keyboard, using one key press to enter the command. Sociologist Mark R. Johnson described the commonality of symbols and glyphs as semiotic codes that give an aesthetic construction of nostalgia by depicting textual symbols of aesthetic forms in their own right, and consistency across multiple roguelikes. With modern computer systems, users have developed alternate means of displaying the game, such as graphical tile sets and isometric-based graphical front ends, as well as interfaces that took advantage of keyboard and mouse UIs. But otherwise still kept the core tile-based gameplay. As computers offered more advanced user interfaces such as Windows and point-and-click menus, many traditional roguelikes were modified to include support for having multiple windows. This was useful not only to show the character-based dungeon, but details on the character's inventory, the monsters they were fighting with, and other status messages in separate windows. Having access to multiple windows also allowed having menus to complete more complex commands. More recent examples of roguelikes that have stayed with ASCII art-based displays include Cogmine 2017 and Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead 2013. It's crazy that we still have ASCII-based games coming out, and it was only 4 years ago. I had a roommate who played a roguelike that he was obsessed with called Dwarf Fortress. And it was completely generated by ASCII. Like, if you asked it to print out a map, it would just get you an ASCII generation of your dwarf fortress, showing you where enemies were, where your fortifications were, where you were, where your troops were. Crazy. With computers and video game consoles capable of more advanced gameplay and graphics, numerous games have emerged that are loosely based on the classic roguelike design but diverge in one or more features. Many of these games use the concepts of procedurally generated maps and permadeath while moving away from tile-based movement and turn-based gameplay, often using another gameplay genre such as action games or platformers. Other titles deriving from roguelike games are based on the observation that the traditional roguelikes are difficult with a steep learning curve, and a player may never complete these games over numerous play sessions, making these titles difficult to sell to a broader audience. These new games would include elements to reduce the difficulty as to draw in a larger audience. Many games with some of the burly interpretation elements call themselves roguelike, but bear little resemblance to the original Rogue, causing confusion and a dilution of the term. As such, the term roguelite or roguelike-like has been used to distinguish these games that possess some, but not all, of the Berlin interpretation features from those that exactly meet the Berlin roguelike definition. The phrase procedural death labyrinth has also been applied to these games, as they retain the notion of permadeath and random level generation, but lack the high value factors normally associated with roguelike games. See, this is why sometimes I just dislike the whole, people arguing over naming schemes, because in the end, does it really matter if it is called a roguelike or a roguelike-like, because it's not a roguelike, but it's roguelike-like? No. It doesn't. It's just semantics at that point. So, roguelites are generally much shorter games intended to be winnable within a single gaming session, in contrast to traditional roguelikes that are designed for multiple sessions of gameplay, or that can be played indefinitely. These games, thus, may have a more narrative focus to tie into the shorter game. Associated with their shorter length, many roguelikes feature a metagame, whereby achieving certain goals will unlock persistent features such as the ability to select a new character as the start of the game, or the addition of new items and monsters in the procedural generation games. So, by this definition, The Binding of Isaac is not a roguelike, it is a roguelite. Several roguelikes feature daily challenges, in which a preset random seed is used to generate the game's levels in a deterministic fashion so that each player will have the same encounters. Players attempt to complete the game through these levels or otherwise get the highest score through online leaderboards. Roguelites may also allow the player to enter the random seed directly, as to be able to re-challenge the same set of levels, or to share a difficult set of levels with other players. US Gamer further defined games they consider edge cases or being roguelikes or roguelites. as they are inspired by rogues, and that stray a bit further from the genre, but still manage to scratch the same itch as a great roguelike. These include games such as the Diablo series, Toe Jam and Earl, and Dwarf Fortress. The latter, which retains the classic ASCII art approach to gameplay as traditional roguelikes. Ars Technica writer Richard C. Moss alternatively suggested that the term roguelike is less necessarily about any specific genre definition, but instead the idea that games can be deep, inventive, challenging, and endlessly compelling experiences through their rules and their systems alone. It's like, I think, I don't know. Like, I enjoy some roguelikes, and I dislike some roguelikes. But it's not like I'm going to go sit here and say, oh, I've got this roguelike, therefore I'm going to like all roguelikes. That's not true at all. Which is why I think this whole argument of, that's not a true roguelike, that is a roguelike-like. I'm just like, why are we arguing over this? Like, it's a genre that's following a similarity, but making it their own. They're trying to expand, right, by arguing over those tiny things. You're making it a lot worse and kind of diluting the playing field. Because if everything stays the same, if everything follows the roguelike, the rogue everything, you wouldn't have graphics. You wouldn't have multiple windows, you know? And the only reason that people are saying, like, oh, it's allowed to have this is because they're like, well, shit, this is a really good game and a great definition of where we have gone in terms of evolution. So we're just like, I don't know. It's just, I feel like they're just so caught up in their arguments over it needs to be the exact same as it has been 30, 40 years ago. And that's not how you get new games, new ideas, new people. If you argue that it has to be the exact same way, it's going to die out when the rest of the people who play the games die. You know? And then guess what? The roguelikes you loved and argued over are gone. So, oh well. Let's look at the history of the roguelike. So the early history, the 1975 to 1980. The creation of roguelike games came from hobbyist programmers and computer hackers attempting to create games from the nascent computer field in the early 1980s, particularly influenced by the 1975 text-adventure game Colossal Cave Adventure, often simply titled Adventure, and from the high fantasy setting of the tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons. Some elements of the roguelike genre were present in the dungeon crawlers written for the Plato system. This includes Petit 5, believed to be the first dungeon crawl game, and featured random monster encounters, though only used a single fixed dungeon level. Petit 5 inspired similar Plato-based dungeon crawlers D&D, Orthanc, Moria, and Avatar. It is unclear if these Plato games inspired the roguelike genre, as there's no evidence that the early roguelike creators had access to these games. The core roguelike games were developed independently of each other, many of the developers not learning about their respective projects until several years after the genre took off. Roguelike games were initially developed for computing environments with limited memory, including shared mainframe systems and early home computers. This limitation prevented developers from retaining all but a few dungeon levels in memory while the game was running, leading to procedural generation to avoid the memory storage issue. Procedural generation led to high replayability, as no two games were alike. And that's what I completely understand. When they created, the only reason these games were procedurally generated was not because they decided that procedural generation was the way to do it. It was because they had to. If they didn't have procedural generation, they could not run their games because they just did not have the memory space for it. You know? You need to be able to, I don't know. It just feels like, whatever. Concurrent variants. Though the term roguelike derives from the 1980 game Rogue, the first known game with the core roguelike gameplay elements was Beneath Apple Manor, 1978, written by Don Worth for the Apple II. Beneath Apple Manor is also recognized as the first commercial roguelike game. The game, inspired by Worth's enjoyment of Dungeons & Dragons role-playing, included procedural generation using a modification of the random maze generated from the game Dragon Maze, a role-playing elements for the characters, tile-based movement, and turn-based combat. Though Beneath Apple Manor predated Rogue, it was not as popular as Rogue. Rogue had an advantage of being distributed over ARPANET, which many college students had easy access to, while Beneath Apple Manor was packaged and sold by hand by Worth either at local stores or through mail fulfillment. Another early roguelike whose development predated Rogue was Sword of Fargol, developed by Jeff McCord, starting in 1979. The game was based on Gamma Quest, an earlier title McCord had created on the Commodore PET, which he shared locally with friends while a student at Henry Clay High School in Kentucky. The game itself was based on Dungeons & Dragons campaign he had run himself a few years prior. Before graduating and attending the University of Tennessee in 1981, he had started working on Gamma Quest 2, which required the player to navigate through randomly generated dungeon levels, acquire a sword, and make it back to the surface with that sword through more randomly generated levels. The more advanced computers available at the school, such as the Commodore VIC-20, enabled him to expand out the game further from the highly limited memory of the PET. On seeing the prospects of selling computer software, he eventually got a publication deal with Epix, where they helped him to refine the marketing of the game, renaming it Sword of Fargol, and giving him access to a more powerful Commodore 64, enabling him to use graphics and sound as part of the game. The game was considered a success, and when it was ported to the PC in 1983, it outshone Rogue's PC release the same year due to Sword of Fargol's superior graphics and sound. See, Fargol-like would be a lot cooler than Roguelike, but I like Roguelike because I enjoy I don't know. When I used to think about Roguelike, I used to think Roguelike, so that's like a stealth game, right? No. 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 And now to look at the actual ancestor of the roguelike, Rogue. Rogue was written by Glenn Wichman and Michael Toy in 1980 while students at the University of California, Santa Cruz. The game was inspired by Toy's prior experience in playing the 1971 Star Trek game and programming clones of it for various other computer systems. It was also inspired by interactive fiction adventure. While looking for a way to randomize the experience of adventure, they came across Ken Arnold's Curses library that enabled them to better manipulate characters on the terminal screen, prompting Toy and Wichman to create a graphical-like randomized adventure game. They created the story of the game by having the player seek out the Amulet of Yendor. Yendor being Rodney, spelled backwards. The name of the wizard they envisioned had created the dungeon. Rogue was originally executed on the VAX 11780 computer. Its limited memory forced them to use simple text-based interface for the game. Toy eventually dropped out of school but got a job at the computing labs at the University of California, Berkeley, where he met Arnold. Arnold helped to optimize the Curses code and implement more features into the game. Rogue proved popular with college students and computer researchers at the time, including Ken Thompson. Dennis Ritchie had joked at the time that Rogue was the biggest waste of CPU cycles in history. Well, computers hadn't been around that long, so history really wasn't much of a history. Its popularity led to the game's inclusion in BSD Unix v4.2 in 1984, though at that time without its source code. Toy and Arnold had anticipated selling Rogue commercially and were hesitant about releasing it. Toy would go on to meet John Lane at Olivetti, and together they would go on to create the company AI Design to port the games for various home systems, along with publishing support by Epix, later bringing Wickman back to help. The following evolution. The popularity of Rogue led developers to create their own versions of the game, though their efforts were originally limited by the lack of access to Rogue's source, which was not released until BSD v4.3 in 1986. These developers resorted to building games from scratch similar to Rogue, but with features that they wanted to see. These features would be distributed with source code, and along with the original Rogue source, other developers were able to create software forks of the game, adding in new monsters, items, and gameplay features, crafting several dozen variants. This procedure was aided by switching code to languages with better typing data, including object-oriented and scripting language, and cleaning up and modularizing the code so that contributors could better follow where changes can be made. While there are some direct variants of Rogue, see Broge, most variants of Rogue can be classified into two branches based on two key games, Moria and Hack. They were developed in the spirit of Rogue. So, Moria-based. Moria was developed by Robert Allen Konecki while a student at the University of Oklahoma, inspired by both adventure and Rogue. Having access to the VAX 11780, but without the source to Rogue due to computer administrator restrictions, he began trying to recreate Rogue, but specifically flavored with the complex cave maze of the same name in J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth stories. Following Tolkien's fiction, the player... Moria. The player's goal was to descend the depths of Moria to defeat the Balrog, akin to a boss battle. As with Rogue, levels were not persistent. When the player left the level and then tried to return, a new level would be procedurally generated. Among other improvements to Rogue, Konecki included a persistent town at the highest level, where the players could buy and sell equipment, and use the data structures within the Pascal language allowed him to create a more diverse bestiary within the game. He got help from several playtesters as well as another student, Jimmy Wayne Todd, who helped to program a deeper character generation system. Eumoria, short for Unix Moria, is a close variation of Moria by Jimmy Wilson, making the game more portable to a larger variety of computers while fixing various bugs. Angband was developed by Alex Cutler and Andy Astrand while attending the University of Warwick. Having played Eumoria, they wanted to expand the game even further. Working from Eumoria's code, they increased the number of levels and monsters, flavored the game based on Angband, the massive fortress controlled by Morgoth from Tolkien's fiction, and incorporated more of the deadlier creatures described within the Middle-earth mythology. They kept the Balrog as a difficult creature that they must overcome at the mid-game level, while Morgoth became the final boss the player must defeat to win the game. Following Cutler and Astrand's graduation, Sean March and Jeff Hill took over the development to see the game through to public release outside the university, adding in elements such as giving the player a sense of rewards and dangers of a level when they entered it for the first time. Once Angband was released to the public via Usenet, there were efforts to have code maintainers, or the dev team, to fix bugs, clean up the code, and implement suggestions into the code. Due to numerous shifts in those maintaining the code, due to other obligations, and the number of potential users' suggestions to include, Angband would become highly forked, leading to a number of Angband variants. At least 60 known variants exist, with about half a dozen still under active development. One significant fork was Zangband 1994, short for Zelazny Angband, which expanded on Angband and altered the theme towards Roger Zelazny's The Chronicles of Amber. The Zangband code base would be used to create Troubles of Middle-earth, or Tome, in 2002, which later swapped out the Tolkien and Zelazny fiction, setting for a new original one to become Tales of Majile in 2009. The vanilla Angband remains in development today by the dev team. That's crazy. That's something. Angband, which started in 1990, still had a fork made out of it 12 years ago. This game was created 31 years ago, which was based off of a game that came out 38 years ago. I mean, you can see why people love these games, but like, holy crap. Hack-based. Hack, 1982, was developed by... So this is the other variant that was created from Roguelikes. Hack was developed by Jay Fennelson with the help from Kenny Woodland, Mike Thome, and Jonathan Payne, students at Lincoln Sudbury Regional High School at the time, while participating in the school's computer lab overseen by Brian Harvey. Harvey had been able to acquire a PDP 11.7 mini computer for the school and instituted a course curriculum that allowed students to do whatever they wanted on the computers, including playing games, as long as they had completed the assignments by the end of each semester. Fennelson, Woodland, Thome, and Payne met through these courses and became a close group of friends and competent programmers. Harvey had invited the group to the computer lab at UC Berkeley, where they had the opportunity to use the mainframe systems there and were introduced to Rogue, inspiring them to create their own version as a class project. Fennelson had created a list of features they wanted to improve upon in Rogue, such as having levels layouts saved once the player moved off that level. They approached Toy Arnold at the local Usenix conference for the source code to Rogue, but were refused, forcing them to develop the routines from scratch. The resulting program, Hack, stayed true to the original Dungeons & Dragons influences and derived its name from being both a hack-and-slash game as well as a programming hack to recreate Rogue without having access to its source code. Fennelson was not able to include all the desired features, and his involvement in Hack's development concluded after the students had left the school. Fennelson had provided the source code to Hack to the Usenix conferences to be distributed on their digital tapes, from which it was later discovered and built upon through Usenet newsgroups, porting it to various systems. Like Angband, the maintainership of the hack code passed through several hands, and some variants were created by different forks. Hack would eventually be dropped in favor of NetHack, 1987, when Mike Stevenson, an analyst at a computer hardware manufacturer, took maintainership of Hack's code. He improved it, taking suggestions from Isaac Miller, a philosophy professor at University of Pennsylvania, and Janet Walls, another computer hacker. Calling themselves the dev team, they began to make major modifications of Hack's code. They named their new version NetHack, in part due to their collaboration over the game being done through Usenet. NetHack's major deviations from Hack were the introduction to a wider variety of monsters, borrowing from other mythologies and lore, and including anachronistic and contemporary cultural elements, such as a tourist class with a flashbulb camera inspired by Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, and the high fantasy setting and the use of predefined levels with some procedural elements that the player would encounter deeper in the dungeons. Further iterations of the game included branching pathways through the dungeon and optional character-based quests that could grant the player an extremely useful item to complete the game. Though the dev team released the code publicly, they carefully maintained who could contribute to the code base to avoid excessive forking of the vanilla game, and remained relatively quiet about suggested improvements to each release, working in relative secrecy from its player base. There are separate forks of NetHack, such as Slash'em, Ancient Domains of Mystery, or ADOM for short, derived from concept presented by NetHack. ADOM was originally developed by Thomas Biskup while a student at Technical University of Dortmund. After playing through Rogue and Hack, he came to NetHack and was inspired by the game, but dismayed at the complexity and elements he found unnecessary or distracting. Biskup created ADOM from scratch with the aim of creating a more story-driven game than NetHack that kept the depth of the gameplay with a focused theme and setting. The resulting game featured several different dungeons, many generated procedurally, connected through an overworld map of the fictional realm of Ancardia, and would have the player complete various quests in those dungeons to progress through the game. A major feature that was the influence of chaos forces through unsealed portals, which the player would have to close. While in areas affected by chaos, the player character would become tainted, causing mutations that could be either detrimental or beneficial. Adam, like NetHack and Angband, would gain a dev team to maintain the code and implement updates and patches to avoid excessive forking. So, other variants. Not all early roguelikes were readily classified as hack or Eumora's descendants. Larn, developed by Noah Morgan, borrowed concepts from both hack in that there are persistent and fixed levels, and Eumoria in the availability of a shop level and general difficulty increasing with the dungeon level. But while these two games have spiraled in size to take multiple play sessions to complete, Larn was aimed to be completed in a single session. Larn also uses a fixed time feature in that the player had only so many turns to complete a goal, though there were ways to jump back in time as to extend play. Omega, developed by the Lawrence brothers in the late 1980s, is credited with introducing an overworld concept to the roguelike genre, prior to the feature's appearance in Adam. Omega was often remembered for its odd inventory approach, in which the players would have to pick up an item, considering it being held, and then moving that object to a bag or an equipment slot. Lindley's Dungeon Crawl, 1995, was created by Lindley Hensel, and featured a skill-based character progression system in which experience points could be used to improve specific skills, such as weapon proficiency or trap detection. One fork of this would form the basis for Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup, 2006. SSI's Dungeon Hack, 1993, offered randomized dungeons and permadeaths with an AD&D 2nd edition rules. So, unfortunately, we're not actually going to be able to even finish the roguelike because we've still got several things to do. And of course, then we've got to do the tactical role-playing, which might be done. But to end this off, I think we'll just quickly hit on the tiny blurb we have about my favorite RPG, The Monster Tamer. A variant of the RPG formula where the player recruits monsters to fight for or alongside them. Collected creatures can often be raised or bred to create stronger monsters or increase their abilities in battles. Examples of Monster Tamer games include Megami Tensei, Pokemon, Digimon, Dragon Quest Monsters, Monster Rancher, Yokai Watch, and Temtem. Temtem I'm interested in, but I'm not interested in paying $40 for it. Yokai Watch I am very unfamiliar with. Monster Rancher was an amazing TV show I saw years and years ago and then forgot about. Dragon Quest Monsters, obviously I love it. Pokemon, obviously love it. Digimon, I've never played the Digimon games, but I'd be willing to look into them. Megami Tensei. Oh boy. That's an interesting one. We might look into SMT, Shin Megami Tensei. Demons. But, yeah, that really is going to be it for us today. And we will pick up with this again next week. Maybe we will finish. Maybe we will finish the role-playing genre. Maybe we won't. Only time will tell. So, thank you everybody for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. And until the next time, everybody, stay funky purple.